morning and welcome to this webinar on crop selection and variety performance, and thanks for joining us this morning. Good to have you online, although clearly we would rather be doing our usual round Scotland roadshows. I hope you're all safe and well. And today I'm joined by my colleague Steve Hoad from SRUC, who will talk about variety choices and selection. And then very pleased to be joined by Catherine Harris from AHDB, who will talk about yellow rust and the new rating system. And clearly yellow rust is one of the major drivers of some of our fungicide inputs and decisions. So I think that's hopefully an interesting package for you today. This series, as I've referenced, is kind of not replacing, but it's to fill the gap where our normal arable roadshows would be. So the choices in the webinar series reflect some of the discussion sessions that we would normally have at the roadshows. We covered IPM last week. Obviously, we're doing varieties today, and then we've got a session next week on business resilience and markets, and then a session the following week on soil health. So I think without further ado, I'll just do a few bits of housekeeping and then we'll get going with Steve's presentation. You can ask questions. We'll have a quick Q&A session in 10 minutes at the end of the webinar today. If you have longer questions or discussion points, we're doing a Ask the Expert session at 11:30. So you might want to hold over those more complex questions until then. So yeah, Steve has pre-recorded a presentation for today just in case of any technical glitches. So we'll run that recording of his presentation on variety selection.
This presentation is part of our series of agronomy roadshows at which we are focusing on the market demands of our different crops and increasing the performance of crops towards those markets, and also taking a view to the longer term stability of our crops and cropping systems. So the topic that I'm going to cover with you today is crops selection and variety performance, and I'd like to do this by reviewing the cereal varieties for the coming year, particularly from the new Scottish SRUC recommended list. So what I would like to do as an outline is to think about progress that's been made in yield of varieties across the different cereal species. But I'll start by just illustrating to you how progress has been made in terms of changes in yield and production from the different Scottish cereal crops. So it's very much looking at the performance on farm with data from the Scottish Government. So after that, I'll review the new Scottish cereals lists to give you an update on the different positions of the varieties. And really what I'd quite like to do as part of that is to give you some insight really into how varieties have made progress and the decision making that lies behind the varieties that enter the list. I think when it comes to performance of crops and varieties now, I think we're thinking much more about integrating yield and quality aspects, particularly for market needs, but also having much more consideration of agronomic value, which is of value on farm and to your businesses. These are the two key references. So this is the link to the new Scottish list, and here this is the link to the complete database from which the Scottish list is derived, with the AHDB recommended lists for cereals and oilseeds. So if we think of yield progress, certainly in terms of crop breeding, there's evidence that there's been a steady increase of about 0.5 to 1% on yield year by year, certainly for the past 30 years or so. But if we actually look at this in relation to what happens on farms, I'm going to start by showing you production in millions of tonnes on this scale here for Scottish cereals overall. So this will be wheat, barley and oats. So what you can see is over this period of time, just about 30 years, you can see that there's been an increase from around 2.6 million tonnes to around about 3 million tonnes, and that's sort of been a trend across the different species, although some have done relatively better than others, and I'll explain a bit more about that in a moment. But the key point here is that with a finite area of land, we are going to need to keep improving yield so that we can continue to meet the demands of the major end users, and by doing so, add value to Scottish production and produce. Just thinking of all cereals, before we go on to the individual crops. Here, the top figure shows the area of the Scottish crop. The bars underneath just indicate 10-year segments. So 2020, 2010, and the year 2000 here. So there's this fluctuation in the area sown to our cereals around about 430,000 hectares per year. So you can see the seasonal variation there. When it comes to yield, we tend to pick up improvements that goes back, say, sort of 20, 30 years ago here, before the turn of the century, but then some evidence of a flattening of yield. And then after 2010, quite a lot of variation, but certainly in recent years, there's some evidence that we are beginning to move away from what we regard as this sort of flattening of yields that that occurred with us for many years. Now, if we look at the cereals individually, here we see spring barley in the top figure. So here, around about 250,000 hectares, we see sort of fluctuation year by year. So this sort of reflects the demand in any one year, the premiums that might be offered, but also to some extent how much winter wheat has been sown and the conditions at spring. If we look at wheat here, so the long-term average is just over 100,000 hectares being sown, and we really need a yield improvement on that area, because it's quite clear that in most years we are in deficit locally for wheat. So we're I think unlikely to go much beyond 110,000 hectares in most years. So the key here is to increase the wheat yield to meet the demands of our distilling and other sectors for that crop. What you'll notice here for winter barley over this long period of time, there's been a pretty much steady decline in the area of that crop. Now that may have consequences for things like optimizing crop rotations, particularly in relation to when this crop can be harvested relatively early. So that might be a little cause for concern that we needed to address. Positively, we can see in oats, so this is oats in total, we can see this after a sort of flattish period of between 20, 25,000 hectares, we can see a recent trend for an increase in that particular crop, particularly the spring crop. So that's reflecting the use of this crop for healthy food products. So on yields then, before we get on to the review, just show you here how the yield trends for these 4 crops. So for spring barley, you can see this sort of flattening as you can for wheat in this phase here. So sort of 10, 15 years ago. And then there's some evidence that certainly spring barley we're starting to see some benefit from the higher yielding varieties. Now, it remains to be seen whether this is a consistent effect of the higher yielding varieties, such as Laureate, for example. Okay. Winter wheat, sort of far more variable, and so wheat, as we well know, has suffered in several recent years with low yields because of the very difficult autumns, sowing time, and then for the more challenging harvests. So quite a lot of fluctuation in wheat yield. So one of the key things here is going forward is stability in crop performance. That's going to become a key criteria for agronomic value. Winter barley, some evidence that over a period of time there has been a yield improvement, and that I think is kind of reflected. We can match that with some of the newer high yielding 2-row varieties and the use of the 6-row hybrids. So I think that's quite a good story about winter barley yields, although as we've seen, the area has declined. And then in oats, again, here we can see a trend for a yield improvement over this period of time, although some variability year to year. So that's really the farm context, and going forward we would like to really think about how we recommend our different cereals so that we can choose the yield improvements that are likely to be realized more stable on farm. This is just the production figure here over that time, so just a composite there of area and yield. So you can see the spring barley increase over that time, winter barley coming down, winter oats coming up in recent years, and wheat sort of fluctuating really quite considerably, mainly because of those challenging growing conditions for this crop. Now, do bear in mind that we do need in Scotland over a million tonnes of wheat each year to meet all our different needs. So so often we are somewhat below that. So there is some need to get a yield improvement for this crop. So on to the review here. I'm just going to reaffirm that we do base this on our national listing data, including the value for cultivation and use criteria, and then into recommended lists where we do place a lot of value on processing and end user tests. And increasingly what we're thinking for our local needs is the interests for growers, meeting these are growers on farm as well as end users. Now in future, I think we're likely to be placing a lot more importance on variety choice and their strengths for resilience in the business and across the rotation. And I think this is going to become much more key. So it's not just out and out yield, it's about resilience and stability that we're going to be placing more emphasis on in future. And I think in terms of genetic improvement, I would consider this is going to be based much more on a broader range of agronomic values so that we're really bringing together yield, grain quality and stability in performance. And one way that we're planning to do this at SRUC is the way we try to include varieties on the list that are very suited or most suited to the local markets and growing conditions, and the way that we can evaluate each trait on a sliding scale from good to poor. And so we believe that this is the way forward for trying to raise the standard across all of the variety features from the poor towards poor end, towards good and very good. So what I'll do now is I'll go through the different crops and just give you an update on the change in position of the varieties, and just sort of highlight one or two points of interest, one or two new varieties that you might be considering for your business for this year and beyond. So in terms of spring barley, the news very much is about what's changing with the Malting Barley Committee approval. So this is the committee, along with AHDB, that oversees the variety development and evaluation. So you may well know now that LG Diablo has gained its full approval for brewing, so now has both full approval for brewing and distilling. So dual purpose in the way that Concerto was and the way that Laureate is now. Concerto has been removed from the MBC list, as have been Sienna, RGT Asteroid, and Propino, which is a brewing variety. Now, the reason for removal from this particular list is very much related to the market interest or lack of it. And it may also reflect the amount of seed production that is available for the different varieties as well. So it's really just giving a good steer as to what that the market is moving towards in the next year or two. So in terms of the position locally, so Laureate dominated the intakes last year. So now ably supported by LG Diablo in that dual purpose role, but also there's a key role for KWS Sassy, which is a malt distilling variety. Fairing remains the only fully recommended variety for grain distilling. So that's really the benchmark variety for that sector. And then I'd also like to draw your attention to two still relatively new varieties, SY Tungsten, that serves both distilling and brewing, and Firefox for malt distilling. Yeah, so that's just a summary of the sort of the pecking order there. We do have for brewing options, which could also be used for feed. We still retained RGT Planet, Cosmopolitan, SY Splendor, and Skyway, and also Prospect as an out-and-out feed variety. Okay. Now, in terms of the outlook, at the moment, there's fairly limited options that's within the RL candidates, both from last year and this year. So most of the candidates have been rated only moderate or poor for the sectors that we're most interested in. So it does mean that for the next 2 to 3 years, it's going to be this list of varieties here that are going to be the mainstay for us, particularly in the quality markets. So if we review now the new Scottish lists, so these are the malting options here, and I've just led this by the level of yield against the control here, and this is the position of the variety in terms of being recommended, year 2, or Sienna here becoming outclassed. I mentioned it's been removed from the MBC list, and then fairing as a special use for grain distilling. So you can see the range of yields here, and that's quite revealing in the sense of yield improvement in recent years. So we think of Concerto also would have been down at this sort of end, around about 92. So you can see the significant jump up towards Laureate's yield, and indeed the varieties that have followed that. So that's what we're hoping to be reflected on farm over the coming 2 to 3 years. The boxes here just reflect the status of the varieties. With Tungsten and Firefox, they've got provisional approval for those particular distilling and brewing sectors at the moment. Okay. When it comes to grain quality and agronomic features of these varieties, well, again, I've listed everything here, and you can see the relative difference in things like the boldness of the grain or screenings, some perhaps underperformance, sort of low levels of specific weight. Next door here, we've got maturity. The varieties are fairly similar. Diablo, perhaps just a touch later than most. Fairing still obviously a bit earlier than all the other varieties. Okay, so if you do have options here, and do think about some of these other kind of minor differences in relation to maturity and perhaps variation in specific weights and screenings. When it comes to Brackling and disease resistance, there's tendency for most varieties to be pretty strong in terms of having low risk to Brackling. A couple are a little bit weaker. And I think when it comes to crop protection, and it's quite clear that it's Rhynchosporium that really does need attention for improvement. So that's the main disease still to look out for. When it comes to the other varieties we've got on the list, well, here I've included a section on brewing and feed. So again, here indicated where the brewing varieties are at in terms of their market position. So with Planet fully approved, Splendor, Cosmopolitan, provisionally approved, and then a new entry, a new brewing variety called Skyway, which is currently under test. So in the new varieties, you can see there is that yield improvement over the older, more established varieties. And for completeness here, this is an out, still relatively new feed variety called Prospect. And then again, just for completion, I put in some of the grain quality and agronomic features. So again, you can see a little bit of variation in terms of maturity, RGT Planet being relatively early for a quality variety, but otherwise not too bad overall. A little bit lower value in terms of specific weight for Cosmopolitan, and I think Prospect makes quite a competitive variety for the feed sector, although not as tall as some of the more traditional feed varieties. So I move on now to oats. There will be fewer choices with several varieties being removed from the list, and this is mainly because of lack of interest in terms of the market pool and the amount of seed that's been multiplied. So with several varieties being removed, the market leaders remain Canyon, Conway, and WPP Eliane. Okay, and then these are now supported by Aspen, although to some extent this pickup is going towards outclassed, and a relatively new variety, WPP Isabel. So this is the table showing those key varieties. So you can see a range of yields here and differences in quality. So do look out for what the end user, what the mill wants. It is encouraging that we've got some pretty bold grains in these varieties with relatively low screenings and some variation in kernel content and specific weight. So do look out for the pull from the mill for these particular varieties, and hopefully we can continue to take advantage of what we see as this yield improvement with a steer towards varieties like Canyon and in future Isabel. So on to spring wheat. This has very much been a sort of consolidated list now, where Malika remains the outstanding sort of Group 1 high quality choice, supported by two Group 2 varieties here, and then a couple of Group 4 feed varieties, Escape being the new feed variety. So consolidated with some reasonable choice there for the different uses, but evidence of some good yield and quality emerging in both NL stages and RL stages of recommendation. So here is the current table. So you can see compared to the high quality Nabim Group 1 variety, the other Nabim Group 2 and Nabim Group 4 varieties have really quite outstanding yield. And overall quality is good with pretty good specific weights and some very good here, and good Hagberg falling numbers. So these are sort of quite robust quality-wise varieties with evidence of a real shift, a real uplift in yield that's occurred in recent years. So now move on to the onto the winter cereals. So winter barley updates here. There's really now plenty of choice in the 2-row feed varieties and the 6-row hybrids. I've said this for a couple of years now, with evidence of yield improvement and some improvement in quality, although it's the disease resistance that really remains a challenge for breeders to lift the ratings. There are 3 new 2-row feed varieties to look out for, and I'll highlight those in a moment. And as I say, there's evidence of yield improvement in trials in the north and across the UK. So let's look at the 2-row feed varieties. So you can see that we've dropped a few varieties, including KWS Cassia now. So against the familiar names of varieties like Orwell and Tower, you can see quite a shift, quite an uplift in yield, with Mountain that we know fairly well, and then the 3 new varieties here, KWS Tardis, Bolton and Bordeaux. So I think that's something that's beginning to be realised on farm with the 2-row crop. Do bear in mind what I've said about the disease resistance. There is quite a drop in the untreated yield, as there is in many winter wheat varieties. So that's something to pay attention to, is the crop protection, even for the very new varieties. So for some of the grain quality and the agronomic features here, so screenings tend to be towards good. A couple of varieties, including the new variety Bordeaux, looking particularly good. Valerie's probably got the more complete package in many of the agronomic features, although it's a slightly lower yielding variety compared to the top yielding Mounting and the very new entries. Okay, so there's a small amount of choice in having some differences in maturity, and likewise some small differences in straw stiffness and straw hide. But I think you've got a real chance now to test the 3 new varieties against the current market leaders, just to feel your way to see what they're delivering for specific weight and yield for you on your farm. So in terms of disease resistance, well, here it is, quite a lot of oranges and reds here, so towards the poor end. So you can see there's real kind of scope for improvement. So very much that the best we can do at the moment is intermediate. This improvement here with KWS Tardis on Rhynchosporium looks quite exciting. So hope to see more of that in future. So I think it's encouraging that we do have a lot of choice here in terms of the quality and the agronomic features. It's the disease resistance aspect that does need more attention for all of your choices. On the 6 rows here, Funky is the only conventional 6-row on the list, and you can see, compared to the hybrids, including the new SY Kingston and the SY Thunderbolt, you can see it's down on yield against those varieties. Interestingly, the 6 rows have quite a sort of spread in terms of yield loss when untreated. So some of them, have a relatively low yield loss, which does reflect some improvement in disease resistance in this type of winter barley. So have a look at these, and make your choices with a balance of yield and also think about things like specific weights, which is generally pretty good among the 6 rows now, among all the hybrids as well. Funky is one that good specific weight, early maturity, but it tends to throw up a few more screenings than the other varieties. So have a look at these and see what difference you get between these and any of the 2 rows that you might be trying out as well. Okay. So on the disease resistance, generally the 6 rows and the hybrids have got a better performance for mildew and Rhynchosporium compared to their 2-row counterparts. So it's quite encouraging to see a few 7s and an 8 for mildew in SY Thunderbolt. So I hope that trend continues so we can fully package this as agronomic value in winter barley. So moving on to wheat now. So as with winter barley, particularly for feed, it's quite an exciting time in the wheat sector for soft textured distilling varieties. So although we've dropped a few, we've got some new entries, but also these are supported by also soft milling NABIM Group 3 varieties that have got distilling potential. So we've got quite a lot of choice for our main sector. We've removed several varieties because of much limited interest from the markets and supply of seed. So it's losing Grafton, perhaps a little disappointing there because that was a good example of a good sort of quality feed variety that was early maturing. But that now is certainly been outclassed for yield by some of the newer hard wheats. And on that particular point, we're quite selective when it comes to hard feed wheat and milling wheat varieties on the Scottish list, and we include them where we think they might add some value for the crop rotation or your management strategy. So just on the soft feed, so the NABIM Group 4 and distilling options here. So this is the complete list. I do note that RGT Sake, it's in this soft feed category, but it is rated poor for distilling. So that's one not to use for that sector. This is a feed only variety. But what you can see here is a range of yields, sort of market leaders here being Skyscraper, Jackal and Elation. But like the winter barley story, there's a lot to protect. Okay, so make sure there's attention to detail in terms of the crop protection, because we can lose 25% of the crop yield when in the unprotected situation. It's encouraging that quite a few of the varieties suit that second wheat cereal position, which is fantastic news. And the column here really emphasizes the position in terms of medium or good for distilling use. Okay, and I'll draw your attention to a new variety called Swallow, which looks interesting agronomically as well as being rated good for distilling. So let's delve into these varieties a little bit deeper here. So this is the quality, grain quality and agronomic features. So you can see a range here, and it's important to make the choices. You've got option now to really make choices based on a combination of different characteristics. So the highest quality in terms of grain properties is LG Spotlight, but then in terms of other features such as earliness and straw stiffness, the new variety Swallow looks really quite interesting. Okay, do note that Sake and Revelation are relatively late, so they would only suit parts of the country, perhaps particularly in the south east and south of the country. Revelation is actually off the AHDB list, but we're likely to keep this variety on the Scottish list, perhaps for one more year. Okay. In terms of disease resistance, well, like the 2-row winter barley, there's quite a lot of scope for improvement here, particularly in Septoria and eye spot. So that's something we're not quite seeing a complete package yet. So, and Sundance is close, but of course, it does have that weakness to eye spot. So we're still hoping to get a lot more intermediates towards goods coming together for the varieties, but we're still sort of two or 3 years off of that. Something else to note with yellow rust here. Obviously aware that we can see evidence of yellow rust across most of the trials, even with varieties with high resistance ratings. But AHDB have changed the way they produce this rating now, with more emphasis on recent years. So what I've actually done for the recommended list, I've not actually included 8s and 9s as greens. It's just flagging up that this particular disease can remain a problem even in the varieties with the highest resistance rating. When it comes to the other varieties on the list, I've pulled everything together here. So these are the biscuit or the NABIM group 3 wheats here. And below, I've just pulled all together in one little table here, all of these, the milling and hard feed wheats. So you can see we're very selective in what we're choosing for Scottish growers in that particular sector. But just to flag up, in the biscuit and soft feed varieties here, the 4 new ones, LG Illuminate, LG Quasar, LG Prince, and LG Astronomer. So these are the new ones, and that unlike Barrel, which is rated poor for distilling, these are all rated medium for distilling. So I think you've got chance this coming autumn to test these varieties alongside the current favourites. And you can perhaps also take advantage or make a test of the varieties where you might have one that could suit a second cereal position. Okay, so I think that's very encouraging in terms of the choice. And so again, I urge you to look at a balance of features for these varieties, and it gives you a chance to make several choices when it comes to soft wheat varieties. We've got Inciter and Gleam as our main feed wheats, our main NABIM Group 4 wheats, and we've included a new variety, RGT Wolverine, which is the varieties that's got the BY/DV resistance. It's got some weaknesses in many of the diseases, hence its very large yield loss when untreated, but it's something so that sort of specialist use for the BY/DV resistance. We've included X-Days, Cabidos X-Days again as a special or specific variety because of some good agronomic features, but do bear in mind that it can suffer from poor seed set in locations that are predisposed to that particular condition. Okay. So final thoughts after the that review. I think we are now considering a lot more features as part of a variety package towards this idea of having an agronomic value. And I think that's going to become increasingly important in breeding. Yield is going to still be very important, but it's its combination with quality and wider agronomic value. And I think that is really going to be what's driving breeding and selection in the coming years. And I think from SRUC's point of view, we're going to start to take much more use, draw much more value from the way that we categorise on this sliding scale the different characteristics. So for spring barley, winter barley, and winter wheat, we can imagine all of these different characteristics being weighted as part of agronomic value. And increasingly, we're going to be looking at stability in terms of both yield and quality year on year. And just as a summary, where there is choice in the market sector, particularly the winter barley and the winter wheat, and perhaps having a partner variety in malting barley to support Laureate and Diabio and Sassy, check out the new options, and where you've got chance to check out the grain quality characteristics as well as the agronomic features. Take advantage of the yield improvements and keep an eye on how you're doing on farm against the national averages that I presented. So we're increasingly considering agronomic value now as part of our longer term crop management strategy. So for the new varieties in oats and spring barley, malted spring barley, do check end use again. And in winter cereals, you do really have quite a lot of options now to boost performance on farm. And I think something I'd quite like to see is more emphasis being based on untreated yield and on treated straw strength, because these really do contribute to stability in performance. So thanks very much. I'll leave you with the two key links from the Scottish list and the AHDB's main list. Okay, thank you very much.
Thanks, Steve. And a nice introduction to the complexities around yellow rust. So let's move swiftly into Catherine's presentation.
Good morning. My name's Catherine Harries. I'm from AHDB. I work on diseases of cereals and oilseeds, and as part of that, I'm responsible for the recommended list disease ratings. So today, I'm going to talk you through some changes that have happened to the RL rust ratings this year. So we're going to talk about why the changes to the rust ratings are needed, what the changes are, so the weighted rating and the reset slope. And then I'll give you a bit more information about something we've just released last week, the Yellow Rust watch list. And since all of these are, apart from the weighted ratings, are relevant for yellow rust today, we're just going to focus on yellow rust in this presentation. So the yellow rust pathogen population has changed drastically in recent years, causing varieties to break down to this disease. And the UK CPVS puts yellow rust into different colour codes depending on the genetics of the different races. These pie charts show how the genetic makeup of the yellow rust population has changed over time. Each slice is a different genetic group, and at the moment we've got red, purple, blue and pink, as shown here. The genetic makeup in 2019 isn't shown, but from what we can tell so far, it was similar to that in 2018. And the United Kingdom Cereal Pathogen Virulence Survey, who keep track of the changing pathogen population, are looking into it at the moment. And these results will be released at the online UK CPVS stakeholder event on the 12th of March, so please do come along to that if you can. We can see over the years the population has become dominated by the red group of isolates. There are many different races of yellow rust in this red group, with each race able to infect a different range of varieties. So even though it might look like the population is getting less diverse from these pie charts, actually we don't know what new varieties isolates in this group might infect. And recently we've seen each year new races from the red group tend to appear, which usually infect new varieties. So for example, there was an unusual outbreak of yellow rust on KWS Zayat and Dunstan in some parts of the country in 2019, and a so-called red 27 isolate was identified as the likely cause. And this isolate is currently under investigation by the UK CPVS. And we've seen the effect of these new races across the UK, with disease appearing on previously resistant varieties. We know that the RL ratings haven't kept up with this changing pathogen population, and more over the years, the ratings aren't reflecting what's being seen in the field in many locations. So for example, this picture on the right is of an untreated trial, a trial untreated with fungicide, with a resistant variety rated with a 9 on the left and a variety rated with a 7 last year on the right. And clearly the variety on the right has much more disease than that on the left and should be getting a much lower rating than 7 if it's like this in most locations. And under the new system, which I'll go on to explain in a moment, the variety on the right has now got a rating of 4, which is much more realistic. The reason for this discrepancy isn't to do with poor quality data from RL trials, because we take extensive measures to ensure data quality. It's the way we've been using the data and the way we calculate the ratings that's the problem, and that's what we've addressed this year. So the first change we've made is to introduce what we call weighted ratings, and this is aimed at enabling the ratings to take account of the rapidly changing pathogen population. So disease ratings tend to be calculated on the last 3 years of data, and using 3 years of data provides stable, robust and really reliable ratings. But up until now, the average disease across the 3 years has been used to calculate a rating, with each year of data contributing an equal amount to the rating. So for example, 2018 would have had a weighting of 1, 2019 would have had a weighting of 1, and 2020 would have had a weighting of 1. And where the pathogen populations are relatively stable, this method provides robust ratings. But where pathogen populations are dynamic, such as with yellow and brown rust, this method takes no account of the increased disease that might have resulted from races present in the most recent year or years that weren't present in the years before that. So where before the previous 3 years contributed equally to the rating, now the most recent year will contribute 3 times as much as the first year. So we can see, for example, for this year's ratings, 2018 has a weighting of 1, 2019 a weighting of 2, and 2020 a weighting of 3. And this means that varieties that have had more disease in the most recent year, for example, because it's susceptible to a new race of rust, will have lower ratings than they would have done if the previous method was used. So let's look at a couple of examples to explain this. So here we've got variety A and variety B, and here both the ratings are worked out using the old method, so giving an equal weighting to each year. Variety A had stable levels of yellow rust. It had 8% in each of the 3 years, and variety B had increasing levels of yellow rust, so 6% in 2018, 8% in 2019, and 10% in 2020. For variety A with an equal weighting, the average level of disease is 8%, leading to a rating of 4.5, which would be rounded up to 5 in the RL booklet. But the average level of disease for variety B when using this old method is also 8%, even though it's got more disease in the most recent year. And if we look at what would happen to these two varieties with the new method using different weightings, variety A would have the same average level of disease and so the same rating of 4.5 as before, but variety B would have its higher yellow rust level of 10% in 2020 be given a bigger weighting and its lower yellow rust level of 6% in 2018 a smaller weighting. And this means it has an overall average level of disease of 8.7%, which leads to a rating of 4.3, which is then rounded down to a 4 in the booklet. So this shows how this new system gives relatively lower ratings to varieties that appear to be succumbing to a new race of yellow rust, such as variety B. But the beauty of the system is if there are no changes yet in yellow rust levels across the years in any of the varieties, then the relative difference between varieties will be the same as if the current method is used. And this new method will only provide a different rating to before when the variety is becoming more or indeed less susceptible over the years. And overall, this has only caused small changes in the ratings this year. We're using this new weighting system for both brown and yellow rust in winter wheat going forwards, and we'll also be looking to introduce it for spring wheat next year. The second change we're making, and this is the change responsible for the big changes in the ratings we've seen this year, is to reset the slope that's used to calculate the yellow rust ratings. So the way that all disease ratings are calculated is by plotting the amount of disease a variety gets against a slope, which gives us a rating. And the slope is determined using known resistant and susceptible varieties to fix the top and bottom of the slope. This chart shows an example of a slope, and the green dots are the varieties we're calculating ratings for. You can see here that all the varieties' ratings are calculated along the slope based on the amount of disease they got. The problem has come about when we've tried to reduce fluctuations in ratings between years. So normally this is the right thing to do, as ratings shouldn't really change between years if there's no reason for them to. But it might happen if there was, for example, a change in the pathogen population. But for diseases such as yellow rust, where there are changes, and these changes have been real, the population has been changing gradually every year rather than the sudden shift we saw in 2016. And this has meant it's less easy to establish definitely which varieties have been affected by the race change and which haven't. And this has allowed the rating slope to gradually creep upwards over the last few years. So you can see this was the slope used in 2012, this in 2015, and this in 2019. And each time the slope gets less steep, it causes the same amount of yellow rust to lead to a higher rating. So for example, in 2012, 10% yellow rust would have received a rating of 4, but in 2019, 10%, the same amount of yellow rust, would have received a rating of 5. And this has also meant that varieties have become more susceptible each year due to the changing races. So varieties that have become more susceptible have been given the same rating when they should have been given lower ratings. So what have we done about this? For this year's ratings, we've reset the slope back down to around the 2012 level. And this means, for example, the varieties with 10% disease will once more get a rating of 4. This not only makes the ratings more representative, it also gives a wider slope, which enables better discrimination between the varieties. And this has a bigger impact on varieties with lower ratings than those with higher ratings. And we will aim to maintain this slope in the future so that each year the same amount of disease gives the same rating across the years. So hopefully we won't need to do this again, and the yellow rust ratings will remain representative of what we see in the field. And this chart shows the impact these changes have had on the varieties ratings this year. I've only included varieties that were also recommended last year in these charts, as new varieties added to the list this year don't have a rating to compare against. The blue bars represent last year's ratings and the green bars represent this year's, and each bar shows the number of varieties that got that rating in the 2 different years. We can see that overall yellow rust ratings have reduced, but it's encouraging to see how many varieties we still have, how many resistant varieties we still have compared to more susceptible varieties. In fact, over half of the varieties have a rating of 7 or above, which is really good. And for those varieties whose ratings have dropped, it doesn't necessarily mean the varieties become more susceptible in 2020, although some of them did. For the most part, large drops are due to the change in the way the ratings have been calculated. And even on varieties now rated with a 3, sufficient yellow rust control can be achieved with a combination of chemical and cultural controls. So please don't discount these varieties. And anyway, it's a good idea to grow a range of varieties that have different resistant ratings rather than all 8s and 9s, because growing all 8s and 9s could put further pressure on the pathogen population and increase the risk of a breakdown in the future. When we look at the changes in the brown rust ratings, we can see there are many fewer changes. Remember, these weren't subject to a reset slope. The only change is using a weighted rating. There are just a few more rated a 5 and a few fewer rated 6 to 9. Something to bear in mind when using the RL yellow rust ratings is that these ratings reflect the resistance that adult plants have to yellow rust, not the resistance at the young plant stage. And this is because varietal resistant genes against yellow rust operate at different stages of the plant's growth. Adult plant resistance should be operating by growth stage 55, but this means that the T0 and T1 and sometimes T2 timings, at these timings the plant may still have its young plant susceptibility. And if it gets yellow rust, it might need a fungicide to keep a lid on the disease. So if you're growing a resistant variety that has young plant susceptibility and you see disease on it before growth stage 55, this doesn't necessarily mean the variety is broken down to a new race of yellow rust. And actually quite a few varieties classed as resistant on the RL are susceptible at the young plant stage, as we can see here. So the final thing I want to talk about is some additional information AHDB have released about how to focus monitoring and management of the dynamic yellow rust population in the 2021 growing season. And we're calling this the Yellow Rust Watch List. If you open this link, which I think you've all been sent as part of the event, then you'll be able to see the watch list much clearer than what I could fit on the slides. So please do open that link now if you can and look at it alongside this presentation. So the watch list aims to show varieties that performed out of line with the main RL yellow rust rating at some sites in the most recent year. So in this case, in the 2020 season. The aim is to pick up early indications that a variety might be breaking down to a new race of yellow rust. So it picks out if a variety is susceptible to an uncommon race of yellow rust. But what we can't know is if this race will increase or decrease in future years. So even if a variety looks not so good on the watch list, it doesn't necessarily mean it will break down the following year. And vice versa, we only have a limited number of RL trial sites, so we could easily miss any new races, and this would give a surprise the following year. So before I go into any more detail, let's have a look at the watch list so we know what I'm talking about. This is the way we're displaying it. It's probably best at this point if you look at the online at the same time so you can see it properly. This column shows the main RL disease rating. So that's the resistance at the adult plant stage after growth stage 55 in the last 3 years. And there's an asterisk next to each variety that's known to be susceptible at the young plant stage. Now here we have KWS Firefly marked as resistant at the young plant stage, but we know there have been reports of it getting young plant yellow rust. And the UK CPVS haven't seen this in their tests, but it could suggest that something might be going on. And this is reflected in its position on the watch list when we look at the adult plant data. We'll look at that in a moment. So this column shows where the variety sits on the watch list. The varieties at the top got the least disease in their worst 3 trials, and the varieties at the bottom got the most disease in their worst 3 trials in the most recent year, so summer 2020. And which trials go in to make this ranking are different for each variety, because it all depends how much yellow rust the variety got compared to all the other varieties in each trial. So you could have a really high yellow rust pressure trial, and a particular variety could have got a lot of yellow rust, but if that variety didn't have any more disease relative to the other varieties than it normally does, then this trial wouldn't have been included to work out the position on the watch list. It wouldn't have been one of those 3 trials. It's only in trials where a variety performs worse than it normally does that we use. And how can we interpret the list? So if we look down the list and look at the main RL rating at the same time, we can see there's a strong correlation between the main RL rating and where the variety sits on the watch list. So varieties at the bottom of the list got the most amount of yellow rust, and overall this year this matches with their general level of disease across the UK in the last few years. As we can see here that all the main RL ratings are low with 3s, 4s and 5s. The same is true for varieties in the medium resistance category this year. These mainly had ratings of 5, 6 or 7. And in the high resistance category, all the varieties had main RL ratings of 8 or 9. But what might we see in a year where a variety was on the start of a breakdown to a new race? Well, we'd see a variety down here in the medium resistant category that has a main RL rating of 8 or 9, or a variety down here in the low resistance category that has a main RL rating of 6 or above, as shown in this column. But it's probably easier if we visualize this in a graph. So this graph shows the main yellow rust rating along the bottom, so low, medium or high, plotted against the watch list category, again low, medium or high resistance. And we'd expect most varieties to be in the bottom right of the graph, as performance in the worst 3 trials is always going to be worse than the average. But what we can do is glean information about how far into the bottom right corner a variety is. For example, if we look at the variety that's furthest into the bottom right here, this is KWS Firefly, a variety I mentioned earlier. We've seen something going on with changes in the young plant susceptibility. And if we look at its position on the watch list, we can see it's the variety that's the lowest down on the watch list compared to its main RL rating of 7. And this is what we want to be looking out for. But this isn't by any means an extreme example. If we were to see more of a breakdown, we'd expect the variety to be in this area somewhere, as it performed much worse in the 3 locations than it did across the country. And we're not seeing this in any of the varieties this year, which is good. It means there aren't any varieties we should be particularly worried about, although I might regret saying that in a few months' time. So how can we use the watch list to help with monitoring and management of varieties? Well, we should always keep a close eye on all varieties for yellow rust, as we can't possibly know which one is going to go down next. But the watch list might help with showing which ones are more likely to. So the varieties we see in the bottom right of the graph should be the ones that are subject to extra close scrutiny and monitoring. And with these varieties, you may need to be prepared to increase the use of rust-active fungicides in the programme. And if you see yellow rust coming into a variety in the spring, it's a good idea to get a fungicide on it to keep a lid on the disease. As I'm sure we all know, yellow rust is easier to control if you do it sooner rather than later. But if we see it in the autumn, then it's unlikely to be economic to spray. Yellow rust is rarely aggressive at this point in the season, and most crops have an excess of tillers, so some tiller loss is unlikely to affect yield. And a targeted approach on the final 4 to 5 leaves should keep yellow rust out during yield formation. And anyway, there's not much you can apply in the autumn anyway. So please continue to send samples to the UK CPVS if you see anything that performs out of line with the main RR ratings, even if it's already low on the watch list. And this means the survey is able to keep an eye on these varieties and these races and understand what's going on. So just before I finish, I want to give a word of caution about using the watch list. Because we use just 3 sites to calculate a variety's position on the watch list, this means that any anomalous results, for example from a misdrill or a mistake in the data recording, will have a huge effect on the calculation. So whilst we thoroughly scrutinise all the data and make every effort to ensure data quality, we can't rule out all errors. We also don't have trials in every corner of the UK, so could easily miss something if we don't have a trial in a particular location. And also poor performance at a variety at certain sites might be down to other things than races, for example, environmental factors. So that's just something to bear in mind. So just to conclude, today we've talked about the new RL rating calculation method, the weighted ratings, which will apply for yellow and brown rust in winter wheat from now on, and the reset slope, which is a one-off change for yellow rust this year. I introduced the watch list, which can show which varieties performed out of line with their average performance in the most recent year, and this is to be used as a management tool rather than for variety selection. Varieties are ordered based on how much disease they got in their worst 3 trials. And this year with the watch list, the good news is that the majority of varieties are in the high and medium resistance categories, and most varieties perform broadly in line with their RL ratings. And just a reminder that the UK CPVS stakeholder meeting will be held online on the 12th of March, and this is normally held in Cambridge, so this year would be an easy year to come if you want to. Finally, I'd like to thank all those who've helped develop and implement these changes to the rust ratings, including our statistician Adrian Roberts at BIOS, pathologist Jane Thomas at NIAB and James Brown at the John Innes Centre. And I'd like to thank the work of the UK CPVS and their steering committee, and also BSPB and the breeders, and the rest of the RL team, RL crop committees and RL project board. Thank you. I'll take any questions after this session.
Thanks, Catherine. Really good to have that unpicked. We are slightly over time, so I hope a couple of you can hang on for some very quick questions. We will come back to the questions in the expert session at 11:30. So I'll take more or less 1 or 2 word answers from my panel of 2 just now, very quickly. Steve, there was a question, quite an interesting one, about the yield curves are obviously increasing. How much of that is due to varietal resistance, and how much of that's due to better agronomy from farmers?
Yeah, I think that's very interesting, both from the the crop trials, but also when we look at the national or Scottish data for yields. And the way we can do that is we can separate genetic and environmental influences in the way that Ian Mackay did when he reviewed the progress in NL trials a few years ago. So there's a bit of both. There's a bit of genetic and but still a strong impact of environment, which can include agronomy as well. But what we need a sort of run of probably at least 20 years sort of to tease out the relative contributions of genetic and environment. But certainly at the moment, both are making contributions. And I think if we could look, say in spring barley, so over the next few years, I think we'll get a feel whether that sort of Laureate and Diablo shift has had a significant impact. So I think yeah, we can tease those out, but we tend to need a lot of sites and several years to do that.
Yeah, that would be a good one to come back to the expert session.
Yes, yes.
Particularly in the context of your plant protection products. There was a question there about Ramilaria scores, so I might take that one myself, where clearly we've suspended the Ramilaria scores at the minute, but assessments are still going on. And from the academic community, there's a good range of resistances starting to come in development stocks. So, for example, in the Danish market, they now have quite a good range. Just to say that there's clearly a link with the MLO mildew resistance gene, which is unfortunate since we've got that in most of our spring barleys, and that the resistance that's starting to come through is quantitative, so it's not an on-off, it's a general tolerance, which actually might be positive. So that's a work in progress. Very final question again, Steve, you might want to come back to this in the discussion session. It's about whether we can break the yields down to spring and winter sown.
Yeah, the Scottish government, because of the size of the database, that they bring oats together. Yeah, no, we'll certainly try and do that. But the official published figures, unfortunately, are for the whole winter and spring. But we will tease that out for people, and that's a good point. Yeah.
Great. Okay, I've got a question that I will hold over on the biscuit wheat, so we'll come back to that at the expert session at 11:30. So thank you both very much for those in-depth presentations, which there will be additional information that the audience can download from the FAST site. So thanks to everybody for joining today for this FAST AHDB and SRUC event. I would urge you to come back to the Ask the Expert meeting at 11:30, so you'll have had the link to that in your join-ups. Like I say, the questions that have come into the chat at the end there, I will hold over to the expert session and we'll come back to them then. So thanks to everybody who has joined this morning. Thank you.